When we think of the Odyssey, it's natural to imagine a great adventure about a man who is trying to return home after a war. Odysseus crosses storms, faces monsters, resists seductions, visits the world of the dead, and spends years trying to reunite with his family. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, however, this becomes a journey through the unconscious, and the process Jung called individuation, meaning Odysseus doesn't only travel across seas and islands, he travels through his own psyche. Just think about it, each character he encounters seems to present a different possibility of existence. The Cyclops, for instance, reveals a life governed by narcissism and the absence of the limits. Calypso offers an eternal happiness that requires abandoning the real world. The Sirens promise an absolute knowledge that is capable of destroying anyone who hears it. Athena guides, Penelope waits, Telemachus searches for his father, and the dead demand to be acknowledged before the journey can continue. The richness of Homer's epic, the Odyssey, lies precisely in the fact that none of these characters above need to be understood only as someone Odyssey encounters outside himself, but as someone Odysseus must encounter, confront, and integrate within himself. Assalamu alaikum, my name is Ulfaris, and this is Spiral Exit. Jung used the concept of the archetype to describe universal patterns that structure human experiences. But this does not mean that there is a collection of mythological creatures living inside us waiting to appear. Keep in mind that archetype isn't a ready-made image, it's just a tendency of the psyche to create certain images, stories, and conflicts. The hero, the mother, the child, the wise old man, the shadow, and the figure of the guide appear in every different mythologies because they represent fundamental human experiences. We all need to live somewhere, face what threatens us, abandon certain illusions, and construct an identity that is capable of holding our contradictions. The images may change over time and according to culture, but the psychic movement remains recognizable. For this reason, Jung wouldn't look at Odysseus merely as a Greek man lost at sea. He could be understood as a representation of the ego setting out toward the unknown and having to establish a relationship with the unconscious contents it can't control. And this process is close to what Jung called individuation.
Individuation is the process through which a person progressively becomes what they are. It doesn't mean achieving perfection, eliminating conflict, or constructing a completely harmonious personality, but it means recognizing that we are shaped by contradictory forces and establishing a more conscious relationship with them. At the beginning of the journey, Odysseus relies mainly on his intelligence. He is the man of strategy and calculation. It was his cunning that created the Trojan horse and contributed to the Greek victory. At sea, however, his intelligence is no longer enough. He must understand that he doesn't control time, the gods, the desires of his companions, the laws of nature, or the consequences of all his choices. This is one of the first wounds life inflicts on the ego. We may plan, predict, and organize, but we remain subject to forces that do not obey our will. For Jung, the unconscious is one of those forces. It's not merely a repository of repressed contents, because it also contains possibilities, images, and aspects of the personality that consciousness hasn't yet recognized. Therefore, Odysseus' journey is the gradual encounter between an ego that believes it knows its past and a psychic world far larger than itself. On land, Odysseus usually knows where he is. At sea, he is carried by storms, currents, and divine decisions. His fate no longer depends on his own will. The sea can be understood as an image of the unconscious because it dissolves boundaries and strengthens the stability of the ego. In it, Odysseus loses companions, direction, time, and identity. He is frequently forced to abandon what he believed he possessed.
The experience of the unconscious produces something similar. When dreams, fantasies, fears, or unexpected desires arise, we discover that we aren't really masters of our own house. There are inner movements that were not consciously chosen yet still participate in our decisions.
Odysseus' task is not to drain the sea or control it. It is to learn how to cross it without being completely destroyed by it. The analytic process also doesn't offer the subject absolute control over the psyche. It allows a person to recognize the forces moving through them and to find less destructive ways of relating to them. Polyphemus is one of the best known figures in the story. So the Cyclops lives in isolation, doesn't have any idea about the laws of hospitality, and devours the man who enters his cave. He has only one eye, meaning he is incapable of accepting any perspective other than his own. In Jungian reading, Polyphemus can be associated with the shadow. The shadow gathers aspects of the personality that the ego doesn't recognize or prefers to reject. It is not composed only of morally negative characteristics, though. It may also contain desires, aggression, creativity, strengths, or vulnerability that a person has learned to exclude from their identity. The problem arises when we believe that the shadow belongs only to the other. Odysseus sees brutality, selfishness, and the absence of law in the Cyclops. After escaping, however, he too is overcome by pride. Although he survived by saying that his name was Nobody, he can't bear to remain anonymous. He reveals his true name to receive recognition for his victory, and in doing so, provokes Poseidon's revenge. Christopher Nolan's film doesn't include this moment. But even after escaping, Odysseus still decides to wound Polyphemus once again. In that moment, the hero who defeats the monster reveals something of the same inability to restrain his own ego. This is one of the Jung's most fascinating ideas. What we don't recognize in ourselves tends to appear projected onto others. We see the arrogance, cruelty, and weakness of others with so much clarity, yet remain blind when they take different forms within us. Odysseus doesn't need to defeat only the Cyclops. He has to recognize the Cyclops within his own need to be admired. Circe transforms Odysseus' companions into pigs. This scene materializes the fear that the human being might abandon consciousness and be controlled only by instinct. Jung didn't believe that instinctual impulses should be eliminated. On the contrary, he believed that the consciousness excessively removed from the body, sexuality, aggression, and nature could become rigid and impoverished.
The problem isn't having instincts, it's being possessed by them. The men, transformed by Circe, lose their human form because they cease to maintain any distance from immediate gratification. They represent a regression to a state in which desire finds no meditation, language, or limit.
Circe, however, doesn't remain merely an enemy. After being confronted, she becomes a guide. She feeds the men, restores their form, and directs Odysseus toward the next stage of the journey. And that change is significant. An unconscious force initially experienced as a threat can become a source of knowledge once it's acknowledged. Jung called this movement integration. It is not a matter of destroying what seems dangerous, but of establishing a conscious relationship with that energy.
So we all know Calypso offers Odysseus something irresistible: love, safety, and immortality. He could remain on her island forever, preserved from aging, loss, and death. Calypso's offer symbolizes a deeply human fantasy, which is the possibility of suspending time and living in a place where nothing has to change. It looks like an existence without risk, without separation, and without the need to face what was left behind. Yet a life without loss would also be a life without transformation. Therefore, Odysseus chooses to return to a mortal wife, to a son who grew up without him, and to a kingdom that may no longer recognize him.
He chooses time, finitude, and uncertainty. From Jung's perspective, individuation requires the subject to abandon certain fantasies of completeness. There is no final condition in which all our lacks will be filled. Maturity begins when we stop searching for a life without conflict and begin to build a possible relationship with reality.
By the way, Calypso also represents the temptation not to continue journey and become just like Oblomov.
When I first encountered the sirens while reading the Odyssey for the first time, I imagined them as alluring, powerful, mermaid-like creatures whose voice lures men to their doom. They can't resist the sirens even though their island is full of bones of their previous victims. However, that isn't their original form. Initially, Greek and Roman art depicted them as creatures with the heads of women and the bodies of birds, often with feathers, scaly feet, and claws. These early sirens were closer in resemblance to harpies than to mermaids we imagine today. In ancient Greek times, sirens were placed at the edges of maps on the boundary between known and the unknown places. They exist where control begins to dissolve, where instinct and curiosity start to outweigh reason. Over time, the sirens evolved. By the Middle Ages, they had transformed into the image of the mermaid. Yet the siren stories still talk about the fear of losing control to emotion, to longing, to something within the self that cannot be rationally contained once awakened. In that sense, the siren is less like a monster and more like a mirror. To one person, she is temptation. To another, she is destruction or just a music. The mind attaching meaning to something external is actually stirring something inside us. Desire, repression, curiosity, fear, and etc., which don't want to remain abstract. They look for form. Sometimes that form is another human, sometimes it's ambition or revenge or beauty or a version of ourselves we are not yet prepared to meet.
Since we can't encounter sirens physically, we encounter them internally, as moments when desire becomes louder than intention, when curiosity overrides certainty, and when something within begins to loosen its grip on what it thought it knew. The whole siren scene shows what it feels like to be drawn towards something without fully understanding why we are willing to move in that direction. There are forces within us that don't always align with logic, yet still feel so real and impossible to ignore. In other words, the siren's story is about a fragile boundary between listening to something outside ourselves and losing the sight of the voice within.
Back to Odysseus. So our hero wants to hear it all, yet he knows he won't be able to trust himself once he falls under the spell of the siren song. Therefore, he orders his men to tie him to the mast and not release him, even if he begs. This scene shows another psychic truth. Knowing the danger doesn't make us immune to it, because consciousness has limits. We may understand perfectly well that a certain desire, relationship, or behavior harm us, yet remain attracted to it. The mast is a symbol for an external structure that is capable of protecting the subject when willpower fails. It may be a bond, a law, a commitment, a routine, or analysis. Odysseus doesn't deny his desire to listen, nor does he blindly trust his own ability to resist. He understands his vulnerability, and for that fact, he creates a limit.
Before returning, Odysseus must visit Hades, the ancient Greek god of the underworld and the king of the dead. During his visit, Odysseus runs into his dead companions, listens to Tiresias, and speaks with his own mother, whose death he didn't know about.
In the film, once again, it's quite different. Anyway, this whole scene shows that no journey of transformation would be complete without an encounter with what has been lost. For Jung, the plunge into the unconscious appears symbolically as a descent. The subject must enter dark regions, temporarily abandon the safety of consciousness, and face anything one would rather kept at a distance. The descent into the world of the dead can also be understood as an image of mourning, or, in other words, nostalgia. The past doesn't disappear simply because time has passed. The people, the relationships, and versions of ourselves that no longer exist continue to occupy corners in psychic life. Thus, Odysseus doesn't resurrect the dead, he speaks with them.
Working through a loss doesn't mean undoing what happened or recovering from what existed before. If anything, it is to allow the experience to find a place in subject's history so that it no longer governs them silently. Only after listening to the dead can Odysseus continue toward living.
As events progress, Athena, Greek goddess of wisdom and war, accompanies Odysseus and his son Telemachus. Although she doesn't prevent them from suffering, she helps them overcome situations they still can't understand on their own. Athena is a symbol of a psychic function that offers orientation when the ego is lost. In analysis, this function doesn't belong exclusively to the analyst. The analyst may help the subject hear something they can't yet able to formulate, but shouldn't decide their path. The deepest orientation must gradually become internal. Athena also offers to confront the conflicts. Wisdom in this sense doesn't consist of having all the answers, but rather it consists of recognizing the moment to speak, to wait, to hide, to act, or to accept that action isn't yet possible. Penelope is usually remembered as the wife who remained faithful during her husband's absence. Her function in the narrative, however, is more complex and active. She weaves during the day and undoes her work at night to delay marriage to one of the suitors. By doing so, she creates time. She doesn't accept the rumor that Odysseus is dead, neither does she surrender completely to the illusion that nothing has changed. Her weaving is an image of psychic work. To elaborate an experience means constructing the narrative, undoing it, and constructing it again. The subject returns repeatedly to the same event because they are still trying to find a way to integrate it.
When Odysseus returns after 20 years, Penelope doesn't recognize him immediately because she fears an impostor. So to test him, she commands her servant to move their bridal bed out of the bedchamber so the stranger can't sleep on it. For context, their bed is immovable. It was carved by Odysseus himself from a single olive tree growing at the center of their household. Apart from Penelope, Odysseus is the only person who could know this. For that reason, Odysseus becomes furious, asking who could have possibly cut their bed away from its living roots. And this emotional outburst instantly proves to Penelope that he is truly her husband. And I believe this is true meaning of returning home, discovering what can still be recognized after change.
Telemachus Odysseus' son grew up in the shadow of an absent father. At the beginning of the narrative, he is unable to occupy his place fully within his house because of suitors. They pressure his mother and treat the young man as someone incapable of reacting. At one point, he has had enough. Thus, he went on a journey to look for his father. In psychology, the father represents origin, limit, authority, belonging, and mission. Thus, his search for Odysseus is also a search for himself. Telemachus needs to construct an image of his father to understand what he will need to create on his own. His maturation, however, begins before their reunion. He travels, questions, witnesses, faces risks, and begins to speak in his own name. In Jungian psychology, the self is the totality of the psyche, which includes consciousness and unconsciousness. The process of individuation brings the subject closer to that totality, although it can never be completely mastered or known. Imagine of Ithaca as the image of the self. The island he returns isn't the same one he left. His house has been occupied, his son has become an adult, and his wife has learned to live with his absence. Therefore, Odysseus must find out who he still is, who the others have become, and what place he may now live. As you see, individuation doesn't take us back to an original, pure, and untouched identity, but rather it allows us to construct a more meaningful bond with our history, including everything we would rather exclude: our losses, desires, needs, contradictions, fears, and failures. Odysseus returns because he survived the experience of becoming someone else.
If you watched this far, let me remind you that this whole time, we weren't just turning every character into a diagnosis according to Jungian analysis. I am making this video to show that myths offer images for experiences we find difficult to name. I am a living human, and so are you. We, as whole species, repeat one another. We all cross seas we can't control. We encounter sirens who promise stuff, islands on which we'd like to stay forever so that we don't have to deal with time or problems of it. And shadows we recognize easily in others but rarely in ourselves. We also need to speak with our dad, undo or remake narratives, abandon certain fantasies, and discover what it feels like to return home that is no longer the same.
Odysseus spends years searching for Ithaca, and his journey is the process through which he becomes capable of inhabiting his own life again. Thus, the Odysseus feels so close to the analytic experience. In both cases, the subject initially believes they are searching for a path back to the place from which they departed. Gradually, they discover that the true journey is learning how to recognize the person who is returning. Until next time, ciao, cari mie.